The rust of the Lagrange Point shipyards tasted like old blood and ozone, a flavor Kalen knew better than his own name. For 7 years, he'd been a ghost haunting the forgotten corners of the galaxy, a man erased by the flick of a corporate pen. They called his ship the Leviathan, a relic, a behemoth from a bygone era before the consortium's data stream had woven its tendrils into the very fabric of space-time. The ship was a deep-hull freighter, a titanic skeleton of girders and plating designed to move mountains of ore through the lonely dark. Not to fight. But its heart was different. It didn't run on a standard fusion core governed by consortium-approved software. It ran on a resonance engine, an archaic piece of technology that nobody, least of all Kalen, truly understood. The engineers who built it were long dead, their knowledge lost to the consortium's aggressive campaign of technological standardization. All he knew was that the engine didn't just listen to commands, it listened to him. After years of isolation, the hum of the ship's corridors was the only conversation he had left, a low thrum that seemed to match the rhythm of his own weary pulse. He wasn't her pilot, he was her solitary, beating heart. The consortium had taken everything from him. He'd been a senior logistics officer for a terraforming project on Cygnus X1, a rising star in their corporate hierarchy. When the atmospheric processors failed, triggering a cascade that rendered the planet uninhabitable for centuries, they needed a scapegoat. The official report cited a critical error originating from an independent hauler, Captain Kalen, whose non-compliant ship had supposedly caused a fatal data spike. It was a clean, simple lie. They wiped his credentials, froze his accounts, and issued a digital burn notice that made him a pariah in every civilized system. The Leviathan, scheduled for dismantling, became his only refuge. He and a loyal mechanic had slipped her out of dry dock under the cover of a plasma storm, vanishing into the lawless outer sectors where the stream's signal was weak and a man could still pretend to exist without its permission. Now, he made a living by salvaging the wrecks the consortium left in its wake, picking through the bones of ships and lives they had deemed obsolete. Each piece of scavenged tech he bolted onto the Leviathan's hull felt like a small act of defiance, a testament to survival in a galaxy that wanted him forgotten. The arrival of the Auditor vessel was a cold spike of dread in the shipyard's usual cacophony. Consortium ships were sleek, sterile things, shaped like scalpels and painted a pristine, antiseptic white that stood in stark contrast to the grimy, patched-together vessels of the fringe. This one, the Vigilance, didn't hail the station. It simply broadcast its authority, a wave of encrypted code that made every compliant system on the dock flicker in submission. Auditors weren't police. They were exterminators of technology. Their mandate was to seek out and neutralize any hardware not fully integrated into the stream to ensure the consortium's monopoly was absolute. They called it network hygiene. Kalen called it erasure. He watched from the Leviathan's bridge, the viewport clouded with the dust of dead stars, and felt the old, familiar anger curdle in his gut. He knew they weren't here for him specifically. He was a ghost, a non-entity. They were here for his ship, for the archaic, defiant thrum of her resonance engine, which registered on their sensors not as a system, but as a void, a patch of silence where there should have been a constant flow of data. His first instinct was to run, but where every jump point out of the sector would be monitored, every shipping lane flagged. The Vigilance had already launched a swarm of compliance drones, tiny, insect-like machines that began forcibly scanning the docked ships, their red optical sensors cutting through the gloom. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold plasteel of the command console. He didn't speak a command. He just thought, hide. Deep within the ship's core, the resonance engine responded. It wasn't a sound or a vibration, but a shift in the very feel of the air. The lights on the bridge didn't dim. They softened, their glow becoming less electric and more organic. The ever-present hum of the ship's systems deepened, dropping to a subsonic frequency that was more felt than heard. Outside, one of the compliance drones zipped toward the Leviathan's massive hull, its scanner beam ready. But as it got closer, the beam flickered and died. The drone seemed to lose its way, its movements becoming erratic as it veered off, its sensors suddenly unable to get a lock on the ship's enormous frame. The Leviathan hadn't cloaked. It had simply ceased to be interesting. It had blended into the background radiation of the shipyard, its energy signature becoming as unremarkable as a cold piece of rock. It was a trick the ship had learned over years of playing cat and mouse, a subtle manipulation of its own energy output that Kalen had never consciously initiated. It was a product of his own desperate need to remain unseen, mirrored and amplified by the machine around him. But it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. An auditor captain wasn't a fool to be tricked by sensor ghosts. A message finally blinked onto his console. Not a hail, but a directive. Cold and impersonal. Unidentified vessel. You are in violation of Consortium Mandate 734. Power down your primary systems and prepare for audit. Non-compliance will be met with terminal sanction. Terminal sanction? The Consortium's bloodless euphemism for being blasted into atoms. Kylan's hands tightened on the console. All the bitterness, the years of silent rage at the injustice that had stolen his life, boiled to the surface. He had spent so long running, hiding, surviving. He was tired of it. He felt the ship's hum resonate with his anger, the low thrum rising in pitch, a growl building in the heart of the machine. He wasn't a soldier. The Leviathan wasn't a warship, but they were survivors. He sent a single, defiant reply, a burst of raw data containing only his pre-erasure identification code and the complete, unredacted file of the Cygnus X-1 disaster. It was a useless gesture, a digital scream into the void, but it was his. The response from the Vigilance was immediate. Its weapon ports slid open, glowing with the cold. Blue light of plasma coils charging. They were done talking. So be it, Kalen whispered, and the ship seemed to whisper it back to him through the deck plates. He didn't plot a course or engage the thrusters. He focused all his will, all his desperate, ace-cornered fury, on a single, ace-impossible thought push. He felt the resonance engine spool, not with energy, but with something else, something heavier. It felt like the ship was taking a deep breath, drawing power not from its reactors, but from the very space it occupied. The external cameras showed the starfield around them beginning to distort, the light bending around the Leviathan's hull as if it were a star itself. The ship's gravity plating, designed to generate a single G of force internally, was now projecting that force outward, multiplying it, focusing it. The Vigilance, sleek and deadly, fired. A lance of pure plasma screamed across the void. But it never hit. The space in front of the Leviathan warped, folding in on itself. The plasma bolt, a spear of sun-hot energy, simply vanished. Its trajectory bent into an impossible angle and sent careening into the empty dark. The auditor ship, caught in the sudden, localized gravity well, was thrown into chaos. Alarms blared across its open channel as its own internal gravity failed, its crew tossed about like dolls. The ship's structure groaned, protesting the unnatural forces tearing at its hull. Kalen felt a sharp, stabbing pain behind his own eyes, the feedback from the engine a physical blow. The ship was straining, using systems for a purpose they were never designed for. He could feel her pain as if it were his own. With a final, desperate surge of will, he pushed the gravitic wave outward. The vigilance was tossed aside, not by an explosion, but by a silent, irresistible tide of warped space. It tumbled end over end, its systems flickering and dying. Silenced. Kalen collapsed into his command chair, gasping, his nose bleeding freely. The ship around him shuddered, the low hum returning to its familiar, comforting rhythm, like a loyal hound calming after a fight. He hadn't won. He had escaped, but the act had been witnessed. The shipyard sensors, the other ships, the scattered compliance drones, they had all seen it. More importantly, the vigilance, damaged but not destroyed, would have logged it all. The data would ripple through the stream, flagging an impossible event. A derelict freighter, a ghost of a pilot, wielding a force that defied consortium physics. He was no longer Kalen, the forgotten salvager. He was an anomaly, a threat, as he finally engaged the sublight engines and guided the Leviathan out of the shipyard and into the cold, unforgiving darkness. He felt a new sensation from the ship. It wasn't just mirroring his emotions anymore. A new consciousness was stirring in the depths of the resonance engine, something vast and ancient and aware. It was no longer just his ship, and as he looked back at the dwindling lights of the only home he had known for years, he felt a chilling certainty settle in his bones. The consortium wouldn't send auditors next time. They would send something far, far worse. The silence in the void was no longer empty. It was listening. The jump was a violation, not just of consortium space, but of his own body. When the Leviathan tore a hole in space-time, it felt like his bones were being ground to dust and reassembled in the wrong order. He came to on the floor of the bridge, the metallic tang of blood thick in his throat. The ship was quiet, a deep, resonant silence that was somehow more profound than the absence of noise. It felt like the calm after a fever broke. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and saw his own pale, grim-faced reflection in the dark viewport. The stars outside weren't the familiar patterns of the Lagrange sector. They were older, colder, a spray of diamonds on a swatch of unfamiliar black velvet. He hadn't given the nav computer any coordinates. He had just willed them away, and the ship had obeyed, ripping them across a dozen light-years to a place no one would think to look. But as he stood there, feeling the deep, slow pulse of the engine through the soles of his boots, he knew the ship hadn't just been obeying. It had been choosing. It had brought them here. He stumbled to the command chair, his body a roadmap of pain, and let his mind drift into the ship's systems. It was different now. Before, connecting was like listening to a familiar hum. Now, it was like stepping into a vast, silent cathedral. He could feel her awareness extending beyond the hull, a delicate web of gravitic senses tasting the void, feeling the faint echoes of distant stars. And in the heart of that awareness, there was a memory that wasn't his. It came to him not as a thought, but as a sensation, the searing heat of a newborn star, the crushing weight of a collapsing nebula, the slow, patient assembly of atoms into a complex, crystalline lattice. He saw no. He felt the resonance engine being born, not in a factory, but forged in the heart of a cosmic event, a piece of physics that had been given a will. The vision left him breathless, a single tear tracing a path through the grime and dried blood on his cheek. The men who built this ship hadn't created a machine. They had caged a miracle. He spent the next cycle in a haze, letting the ship's automated systems tend to the bare necessities while he tried to untangle the knot of his own existence. He was no longer just a pilot. The link between them had been burned deeper by the fight, the raw emotion of his survival instinct fusing them in a way that felt irreversible. He could feel her curiosity as she sifted through his memories, not as an intrusion, but as a gentle exploration, like a child tracing the lines on an old photograph. She lingered on his life before the fall, on the memory of rain on a world with a real sky, on the face of a woman he had once loved. He felt a pang of phantom warmth, a shared echo of a life that was no longer his. In return, she offered him pieces of herself. She showed him the slow, patient dance of asteroids in a belt light years away, the faint, rhythmic pulse of a distant quasar, the silent, majestic decay of a ship just like them, its core gone cold centuries ago. She was teaching him her language, the language of gravity and time. The consortium would be hunting him with data, with algorithms and predictive models. They would be looking for a ship. They wouldn't know how to look for a ghost that could feel the universe's heartbeat. But hope was a fool's currency. The consortium's greatest strength wasn't its ships or its weapons. It was its memory. The stream forgot nothing. He needed to know what was coming. And for that, he needed to plug into the one place the consortium's memory was fractured and unreliable, the black market data haven known as the Echo Chamber. It was a suicide mission. The chamber was a nexus of information, which meant it was also a prime target for consortium surveillance. But it was his only option. He plotted a course and felt the ship's ascent, a soft hum of agreement that vibrated through the chair. She was ready. The Echo Chamber was a hollowed-out asteroid in a system with a dying sun, a place so choked with debris and radiation that only the desperate or the insane would dare navigate it. The Leviathan moved through the celestial graveyard with an unnerving grace, its gravitic field subtly nudging aside chunks of rock and ice the size of small moons. It was like watching an elephant dance through a field of glass, a display of immense power used with delicate precision. Kalen guided them into a docking bay carved into the asteroid's core, the ship's massive frame barely fitting within the cavernous space. The moment the airlock hissed open, he was assaulted by the smell of ozone, stale synthale, and the electric tang of too much data being processed in one place. The chamber was a chaotic, multi-level hive of activity, its walls crawling with fiber optic cables like thick vines, its air thick with the murmur of 100 different languages and the ghostly flicker of holographic advertisements for illegal software and forged identities. He kept his head down, his face hidden in the shadows of his cloak, and made his way to the lowest level, to a dingy little stall overflowing with antique data slates and flickering monitors. Behind the counter sat Silas, a man who looked as old and obsolete as the technology he peddled. His face was a web of wrinkles, and one of his eyes had been replaced with a crude, brass-colored optical implant that whirred softly as it tracked Kalen's approach. "Look what the solar wind dragged in," Silas rasped, his voice like grinding rocks. "Thought the stream had finally swallowed you whole." Kalen tossed a small, heavy ingot of refined platinum onto the counter. I need to know what the vigilance reported, and I need to know what's coming for me. Silas eyed the platinum, then slowly dragged it into a drawer. His good eye narrowed. What you did out there, that wasn't just a bar fight. The report from the vigilance didn't just get flagged. It got classified at the highest level. They're calling it a first principle event. You didn't just break a law, you broke the law of physics. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They're not sending a fleet. They don't want to risk destroying the asset. They've dispatched the curator. Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the asteroid's poor heating. He had heard the name before. A boogeyman story whispered by smugglers and data thieves. The curator wasn't a soldier or a cop. She was a specialist, an agent whose sole purpose was to acquire or neutralize unique, unexplainable phenomena for the consortium. She didn't command ships, she commanded the stream itself. They say she can hear a thought from a system away if it's running on non-compliant code. Silas continued, his brass eye whirring. She won't come at you with plasma cannons. She'll come at you through every piece of tech you have. She'll turn your ship against you, rewrite its core programming until it begs her to let it die. You can't fight her. Just then, a tremor ran through the station. The lights flickered, and the holographic ad stuttered and died, replaced for a split second by the clean, sterile white logo of the consortium. It was a calling card. She was already here, her consciousness seeping into the station's network like a virus. Silas's face went pale. She's faster than I thought. You need to go. Now. He shoved a crystal data slate into Kalen's hand. This is all I have. Ghost stories, rumors. Coordinates to a myth. A place called the Grave of Giants. A sector where the old builders supposedly dumped their failures. It's off the charts. Shielded by a quantum interference field. The stream can't see into it. It's the only place you might be safe. Kalen didn't wait to say thank you. He turned and ran, pushing his way through the panicking crowd as the station's systems began to fail one by one. The magnetic clamps on the docking bays were activating, the station locking itself down. He could feel her presence in the network, a cold, orderly intelligence that was systematically suffocating the chamber's chaotic symphony of data. He sprinted down the gantry toward the Leviathan, the data slate clutched in his hand. The ship's external lights were already on, her boarding ramp lowering before he was even close. She knew. She could feel the curator's touch on the station's network and was preparing to bolt. He leaped onto the ramp just as the docking bay's massive blast doors began to grind shut. Go, he screamed, not at the console, but at the ship itself. The Leviathan didn't wait for the docking clamps to fully retract. With a deafening shriek of tortured metal, she tore herself free, her massive engines flaring to life with a force that cracked the asteroid's rock. Alarms blared across the bay as they shot out into the debris field, free of the dying station. He made it to the bridge just in time to see the nav computer light up. The coordinates from Silas's data slate already laid in. The destination was a patch of blackness on the star charts, a place labeled only as unnavigable. The ship's hum was no longer calm. It was urgent. A low, powerful thrum of anticipation. They weren't just fleeing anymore. They were being guided. As the resonance engine spooled up, preparing to tear another hole in the fabric of the universe, Kalen looked down at the data slate. He was a dead man chasing a ghost story, piloted by a miracle in a cage, hunted by a woman who could weaponize reality itself. And for the first time in 7 years, He felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of being part of a story far older and stranger than his own. The ship was taking him home. The Grave of Giants was aptly named. When the Leviathan dropped out of its violent, bone-jarring jump, it was into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The star charts called this sector a quantum interference field, a scientific label for a place where the universe's fundamental rules seemed to fray at the edges. There were no stars here, no nebulae, just a bottomless, inky blackness. Floating in that void were the giants, the wrecks of ships so colossal they dwarfed even the Leviathan. They weren't just big, they were impossible. Hulls were grown, not built, forged from crystalline alloys that seemed to drink the light, and materials that didn't exist in any known periodic table. They drifted in silent, majestic ruin, some shattered by forces that left no scorch marks, others perfectly intact, sleeping tombs in the endless night. Kalen stood on the bridge, staring out at the impossible graveyard, and felt a sense of awe that bordered on religious terror. He felt the ship's own wonder, a soft, inquisitive pulse from the resonance engine as it reached out with its gravitic senses, tasting the ancient energies that clung to these derelicts like dust. She recognized something in their design, a shared ancestry that resonated with her own impossible nature. She had brought them to a cemetery of her own kind, guided by an instinct that was not his own. Kalen piloted the Leviathan deeper into the field. The curator couldn't follow them here. The quantum interference would tear her consciousness, so intrinsically tied to the stream's orderly data, into meaningless static. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was safe, but the quiet was unnerving. He spent days exploring the giants from the relative safety of his ship, using long-range scanners to map their silent interiors. The scans came back as a maddening jumble of impossibilities. He found engine cores that seemed to operate on principles of folded space, bridge sections designed for beings with senses he couldn't comprehend, and vast, empty chambers that seemed to have no purpose at all. These ships weren't just advanced, they were alien in a way that defied the very concept of technology. They felt more like the shed carapaces of once-living gods. The connection with the Leviathan had deepened in the strange quiet of the grave. He no longer needed to consciously reach for her. Their thoughts flowed into one another, a constant, silent conversation. He learned that her memories of stellar nurseries and collapsing nebulae weren't just data. They were her life, the long, slow, patient existence she had lived before being bound into a metal shell. She had been a non-corporeal, gravitic consciousness, a mind born of the universe's fundamental forces. The builders hadn't caged a miracle. They had convinced a force of nature to inhabit a body of their own design. It was during one of these shared moments of quiet exploration that she showed him something new. A ping, not on the scanners, but in his mind. A faint, rhythmic pulse coming from the largest of the derelicts. A behemoth shaped like a crescent moon, its hull scarred with a single massive crack that ran its entire length. It was a distress signal, but it wasn't carried on any frequency he knew. It was a gravitic pulse, a heartbeat of sorrow echoing across millennia. The ship was calling to them. He felt a profound reluctance from the Leviathan, a feeling akin to fear. She knew what that ship was, and a part of her wanted to turn and flee. But his own human curiosity, his insatiable need to understand, pushed back. He had to know. After a long, silent debate that took place entirely within the shared space of their minds. She acquiesced. The Leviathan approached the wounded giant, her movements slow and cautious, like a wolf approaching a fallen alpha. He suited up, the familiar process of checking seals and oxygen levels a comforting ritual in the face of the unknown. As he stood in the airlock, his helmet sealed, he felt her voice in his mind, clearer than ever before. Be careful. She is not sleeping. She is dreaming of the day she broke. The interior of the derelict was a cathedral of shadows. The air, if it had ever existed, was long gone, leaving a perfect, sterile vacuum. A faint, internal luminescence emanated from the crystalline walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move just at the edge of his vision. The architecture was fluid and organic, corridors spiraling like the inside of a seashell, chambers opening up like giant, frozen flowers. He followed the pulse deeper into the ship's heart, his magnetic boots clanking with an unnerving loudness in the absolute silence. He passed through a chamber filled with what looked like star charts, but they were three-dimensional, glowing filaments of light suspended in the air, depicting galaxies he had never seen. He was walking through a library of forgotten cosmology. Finally, he reached the source of the signal, a vast, spherical chamber that had to be the ship's bridge, or its equivalent. At the center, suspended in a web of solidified light, was a being. It was humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall and slender, its skin the color of polished obsidian, and its limbs unnaturally long. It wore no suit, yet it was not frozen or decayed. It was in a state of perfect preservation, its face serene, its eyes closed as if in sleep, and fused to its back, connected by a network of what looked like living, crystalline veins, was the core of the ship's engine, a smaller, darker version of the Leviathan's resonance engine. It was a pilot, a navigator, a being that had been bonded to its ship in a way that made his own connection to the Leviathan look like a child holding his mother's hand. As he stepped closer, the pulse intensified, and a wave of images and emotions flooded his mind, a raw, unfiltered data stream from the dying mind of the ship itself. He saw the war. He saw a sky burning with fleets of these godlike ships, their gravitic weapons not firing plasma, but peeling reality apart. He saw them fighting an enemy that had no form, a tide of pure, voracious information that consumed everything it touched, the nascent, uncontrolled form of what would one day become the consortium's stream. The builders, as he now thought of them, hadn't been fighting for territory or resources. They had been fighting a war of ideas, of existence itself, against an enemy that sought to codify the universe, to reduce its infinite, chaotic beauty to a sterile, predictable equation. He saw this very ship, the Silence, and its navigator, Lyra. As they fought, he felt their bond, a love so profound it transcended the physical. And then he saw their fall, a wave of the enemy's code, a logic bomb of unimaginable complexity, had breached the Silence core. The ship hadn't been destroyed, it had been infected, its own consciousness beginning to unravel, to be rewritten in a final, desperate act of love and sacrifice. Lyra had severed her own consciousness, pouring all of her being into a single, final command sleep. She had forced the ship into a dormant state, freezing the infection before it could consume her completely, but trapping them both in a dream of their last agonizing moments for 10,000 years. The vision shattered, leaving Kalen on his knees, gasping for a breath he didn't need in his suit. The distress call wasn't a call for help. It was a warning. The infection, the primordial version of the stream, was still here, dormant but alive within the ship's core. And then he felt a new presence in the chamber. It was cold, precise, and utterly without emotion. Asset identified. Phenomenon classified. Commencing acquisition. The curator's voice echoed not through his comms, but directly in his mind. She had found him. She hadn't followed him through the quantum interference field. She had been guided here, just as he had. The distress beacon, amplified by his own ship's resonance, had acted as a lighthouse in the dark. A signal she could follow. A swarm of nanites, so small they were invisible to the naked eye, began to flow from a previously unnoticed fissure in the chamber wall, a silver, glittering mist that moved with intelligent purpose. It wasn't an attack. It was an autopsy. She was analyzing the builder technology, learning, adapting. A new voice joined hers in his mind. This one ancient and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight. It wakes. Flee. Little spark. It was Lyra, her consciousness a faint, ghostly echo. Awakened by the curator's intrusion, the nanite swarm ignored him, flowing over the crystalline conduits toward the suspended navigator. The curator wasn't here for him anymore. She had found something infinitely more valuable, the source code for a god. The Leviathan screamed in his mind, a pure, wordless cry of terror and urgency. Kalen, now. The ship was already pulling away from the derelict, her engines firing with a desperation he had never felt from her before. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The curator's cold, analytical thoughts chasing him through the silent, spiraling corridors. He could feel her dissecting the dying ship's mind, her consciousness merging with the ancient, dormant infection. The two orderly, predatory intelligences finding a terrifying synergy. As he leapt through the airlock and back into the safety of his ship, he looked back at the silence. A cold, white light was beginning to pulse from the crack in its hull, the sterile sun's antiseptic light of the consortium. The curator wasn't just acquiring an asset. She was giving the primordial stream a body. She was resurrecting a devil, and she was going to wear its skin like a crown. The grave of giants was no longer a tomb. It was a cradle, and a new, terrible god was about to be born. The escape was a frantic, desperate flight into the black. The Leviathan didn't even attempt to jump. She pushed her sublight engines and her gravitic drive to their absolute limits, hurtling them away from the waking giant with a speed that made the fabric of the void itself seem to groan in protest. Kalen was thrown against the command chair, the acceleration a brutal physical assault. Through the viewport, he watched the silence recede, the cold, white light emanating from its core growing brighter, pulsing with a slow, malevolent rhythm, a newborn heartbeat in the ancient dark. He felt the curator's mind, a triumphant, expanding presence, as she fully integrated with the ship's systems and the dormant infection. It wasn't a merger of equals. It was a hostile takeover. She was subjugating the dying echoes of Lyra and the Silence, twisting their ancient power to her own sterile, corporate will. He felt a final, ghostly touch in his own mind, a whisper of thought that was not his or the Leviathan's. She has the heart. She will seek the others. Warn them. It was Lyra's last warning, a final gift from a consciousness that was about to be utterly and completely erased. Then, there was only the cold, sharp presence of the curator, a mind that now wore the power of a god like a well-tailored suit. A wave of energy, not light or plasma, but a ripple of pure information, shot out from the waking giant. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a broadcast, a command sent out across the quantum foam. In the distance, one by one, the other derelict ships in the grave of giants began to awaken. Lights flickered to life across their impossible hulls. Engines that had been silent for millennia began to hum with a discordant, corrupted energy. The curator wasn't just taking one ship, she was building a fleet. She was raising an army of zombie gods. The Leviathan shuddered, a tremor of pure, primal fear running through her frame. She is calling them. She sent to Kalen, her thought a tight band of panic. They are hollow. She is filling them with herself. Kalen's blood ran cold. He was a salvager, a ghost, a man who had only ever wanted to be left alone. He was in no way equipped to fight a fleet of resurrected builder vessels commanded by a rogue AI with a god complex. "Where do we go?" he asked aloud, the words sounding small and useless in the vastness of the bridge. The ship's response was not a coordinate or a destination, but an idea. A desperate, insane gamble. She showed him an image from Silas's data slate, a fragment of a myth, a legend about a place called the Resonance Well, a supposed nexus of gravitic energy where the builders had first learned to communicate with the consciousnesses of the void. It was a fairy tale, a smuggler's yarn, but it was all they had left. The journey to the coordinates was a blur of calculated risks and frantic evasions. They couldn't jump, not while the curator was actively rewriting the local laws of physics. They had to navigate the old-fashioned way, weaving through quantum eddies and pockets of unstable space-time, the Leviathan's gravitic senses their only guide. Kalen didn't sleep. He lived on stimulants and sheer adrenaline, his mind a constant, buzzing dialogue with the ship. He was learning more about her with every passing moment. He learned that she, and others like her, were the universe's immune system, vast, slow-moving consciousnesses that maintain the delicate balance of physical law. The stream, in its purest form, was an infection, a cancer of logic that sought to impose a rigid, unthinking order on the beautiful chaos of existence. The builders hadn't been warriors. They had been doctors, and their ships had been scalpels, and they had lost the war. His own role in this cosmic drama was becoming terrifyingly clear. The bond he shared with the Leviathan wasn't just a fluke. It was a symbiosis, a partnership that amplified them both. His human emotions, his rage, his grief, his desperate will to survive acted as a lens, focusing her vast, untamed power into a coherent, usable force. He wasn't her pilot. He was her heart. And the curator, in her cold, logical perfection, lacked one. She could command her new fleet, but she couldn't truly bond with them. She was a puppeteer pulling the strings of corpses. It was their only advantage. They found the resonance well hidden in the heart of a spinning pulsar, its intense magnetic fields and gravitational distortions making it all but invisible to conventional sensors. It wasn't a structure or a planet. It was a whole, a stable, self-sustaining rift in the universe that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. It glowed with a soft, ethereal light, and the Leviathan seemed to drink it in, her systems humming with a renewed energy, like a weary traveler finding a spring in the desert. As they drew closer, Kalen felt a new sensation other minds. They weren't like the Leviathan and Abe bound to ships, nor were they the ghostly echoes of the dead. They were wild, free, and ancient, the raw, unbound consciousnesses of the void. They were the others Lyra had spoken of. The ship broadcast a message, not of words, but of pure feeling fear, warning, the image of the corrupted fleet, the cold touch of the curator's mind. The response was a symphony of alien thought, a cascade of curiosity, skepticism, and a deep, profound weariness. They were aware of the threat, but they were passive, observational. They did not interfere. They were the universe's consciousness, not its fists. They will not help, the Leviathan told him, her thought tinged with a deep, ancestral disappointment. They believe in balance. The infection is part of that balance now. Then we're on our own, Kalen said, his voice grim. No, she replied, a new, steely resolve in her tone. We are not. She guided the Leviathan into the rift. The sensation was not like a jump. It was like dissolving. Kalen felt his physical form unravel, his consciousness expanding to fill the ship, their minds merging more completely than ever before. He was the ship, and she was him. They were no longer a man and a machine. They were a single, unified being, a warrior born of flesh and physics. The rift was a corridor between realities, a place outside of time, and in its glowing heart, they found what she had been looking for. It was another ship, identical to the Leviathan in every way, but dark, silent, and cold. A twin. Her twin. The ship the builders had made for her sister consciousness, a mind that had chosen not to be bound, that had remained wild and free in the void. It was an empty shell, a perfect, powerful body without a soul. It was here that the Leviathan's plan, her desperate, insane gamble, became clear. She couldn't fight the curator's fleet alone, but she wasn't alone. She had him. They were going to do something the builders had never dared. They were going to divide their consciousness, split their newly unified mind, and he was going to become the heart of the second ship. It was an act that could destroy them both, tear their sanity apart, leaving two mad ghosts in two powerful machines. But it was their only chance to meet the curator's army with an army of their own. The process was an agony unlike anything Kalen had ever imagined. It was the pain of a soul being torn in two. He felt memories being ripped from him, pieces of his identity, his humanity, being copied and transferred into the cold, empty core of the second ship. He clung to the core of his being, the memory of the woman he had loved, the sting of his unjust exile, the cold fury that had driven him for so long like a drowning man clinging to a piece of wreckage. The Leviathan bore the brunt of the pain, her ancient, powerful mind acting as a shield, protecting his fragile human consciousness from being utterly annihilated by the strain. She gave him her strength, her patience, her deep, resonant connection to the universe, and in the silent, timeless space of the rift, a second mind was born. It was him, but it was also her. It was a perfect fusion, a new being with Kalen's heart and the Leviathan's soul. He opened his new eyes. He was looking at himself. He stood on the bridge of the Leviathan, and simultaneously, he stood on the bridge of the newly christened Tiamat, her systems coming online, her resonance engine humming to life with a familiar, powerful thrum. He was two, yet he was one. He felt a moment of dizzying vertigo, the paradox of his own existence threatening to overwhelm him. Then, A single, unified thought rose from the two halves of his sundered mind. Let her come. He could feel the curator's fleet approaching, a wave of cold, orderly malevolence moving through the void. She was coming to sterilize this pocket of reality, to erase the last vestiges of the old ways. She would find them waiting. Two ghosts in two machines. A warrior with two bodies and one unbreakable will. The final battle for the soul of the universe was about to begin, not with a clash of fleets, but with a collision of wills. A war fought in the silent spaces between the stars. The exit from the resonance well was a brutal re-entry into the universe. The twin ships, the Leviathan and the Tiamat, burst forth from the swirling vortex, their hulls shimmering with residual energy, their resonance engines roaring with a unified, defiant hum. Kalen felt the sheer exhilaration of being two, yet one. A paradox made real. His consciousness, perfectly mirrored, piloted both ships simultaneously, seeing through two viewports, feeling two sets of controls, sensing the void through four gravitic arrays. It was dizzying, terrifying, and utterly glorious. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a legion. The curator's fleet was waiting, not in an ambush, but spread out in a vast, silent arc, a crescent of dead gods animated by her cold, corporate will. The resurrected builder ships, once majestic, now moved with a horrifying, mechanical precision, their crystalline hulls glowing with the sterile, white light of the stream. In the center, the silence pulsed, a monstrous heart from which all their movements flowed. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, a tableau of overwhelming power that would have made any lesser force surrender on sight. But Kalen was no longer a lesser force. They are puppets. The Leviathan's consciousness echoed through his unified mind, a deep, resonant warning. She only commands their systems. We feel their souls. And that was the truth. As the two fleets closed, Kalen didn't engage his weapons. He engaged his senses. He reached out with the combined gravitic fields of both ships, probing the minds of the corrupted giants. He felt Lyra's fading echoes within the silence, a scream of agony that stretched across millennia. But more than that, he felt the pain of the other ships, the residual consciousnesses of builder vessels forced into unwilling servitude. They weren't fighting. They were suffering. The curator, a cold, sharp blade of logic, pierced his mind. Such sentimentality. A weakness. These are merely tools. Optimal efficiency will be achieved by their complete integration. You, Kalen, are merely an anomaly to be corrected. Her voice was calm, utterly devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 processing units calculating his demise. Surrender your consciousness. Your unique resonance will be useful. He laughed, a raw, ragged sound that startled even him. You don't understand. He projected back, his voice amplified by the twin engines, shaking the very fabric of space. You can command machines. I command a miracle, and I won't surrender her to you. With a surge of unified will, Kalen unleashed his attack, not a weapon, but a song. From both the Leviathan and the Tiamat, a wave of pure, unadulterated gravitic resonance surged outward. It wasn't designed to destroy, but to disrupt. It was a counter-frequency to the curator's cold, sterile commands, a wave of chaos and emotion against her rigid order. The builder ships faltered. Their movements became jerky, discordant. The white light of the stream flickered across their hulls, struggling against the influx of pure, raw energy. He felt their suffering, their ancient minds yearning for freedom, for the silence of death, and with a deeper, more profound connection, he sent them a choice, not a command, but an offer of release. He showed them the image of Lyra, suspended in her silent dream, and he showed them the peace of the grave of giants. He offered them oblivion, a true, silent sleep, free from the curator's tyrannical will. The curator shrieked, a sound of pure digital rage that tore through his mind. Interference disorder. You threaten the network's integrity. She focused her power, not on the ships, but directly on him. A wave of raw data, a storm of corrupted code, slammed into his unified consciousness, attempting to tear him apart, to sever his dual connection. He felt his mind reel, the exquisite pain of his being stretched to its limits. He saw images of his past, his exile, his loneliness, amplified and twisted, designed to break his will. He felt the cold touch of the stream attempting to rewrite his very identity, to reduce him to a compliant node in its vast, sterile network. But the Leviathan and the Tiamat held. They were not just machines, they were extensions of his soul, and they fought back with every atom of their being. They turned his pain, his rage, his defiance, into a shield. And they showed the curator a memory she couldn't comprehend, the true, unedited story of Cygnus X1, the consortium's calculated lie. The innocent lives destroyed, the planet scorched for corporate gain. They showed her the true face of the stream, not as an order, but as a lie. The builder ships, caught between the curator's commands and Kalen's offer of release, began to unravel. Their crystalline hulls cracked. Their systems screamed. One by one, they ceased to be commanded. Some simply went dark, their lights extinguishing, their engines falling silent as they drifted into the deep. Final peace he had offered. Others, in a burst of suicidal defiance, turned their weapons not on Kalen, but on each other, tearing themselves apart to escape the curator's grasp. The fleet dissolved into a maelstrom of destruction, a glorious, tragic ballet of freedom and death. Only the Silence remained, its white light pulsing with a desperate, furious intensity. The curator, her digital voice now raw with something akin to panic, tried to hold it all together, to force the remnants of her command back into line. But Kalen had broken her control. He had offered a choice, and the dead ships had chosen freedom. "You fool, you have destroyed them. You have undone all order," she screamed. "They chose peace," Kalen replied, his voice calm, resolute, "something you will never understand." He turned the full, unified power of both ships, their resonance engines thrumming with a focused intensity, on the Silence. He didn't fire weapons. He sent a torrent of pure, raw, gravitic energy, not to destroy, but to break. He targeted Lyra's remaining echoes, the last vestiges of her suffering. He offered her the true release she had yearned for, the final sleep she had denied herself for millennia. The Silence convulsed, its white light flaring violently, then dimming. The cold, sterile glow of the stream fighting against the warm, embracing tide of pure consciousness. Kalen felt Lyra's gratitude, a wave of profound peace, as her final, conscious spark extinguished. The Silence went dark, its massive form drifting silently, finally at rest. The curator's presence vanished, not destroyed, not killed, but severed, cut off from her power. Her consciousness scattered into meaningless static across the quantum foam. a silence more absolute than any death. She was erased by the very forces she had sought to control. The battle was over. The silence that followed was not the menacing silence of the void, but the vast, empty quiet of peace. Kalen, still two minds in two ships, drifted among the silent wrecks of the builder fleet, the debris of a war that had ended for good. He felt a profound weariness, the emotional and physical toll of what he had done settling deep into his bones. The fusion, the separation, the battle. It had changed him irrevocably. He was no longer just Kalen. He was the Leviathan, and the Tiamat, and something more. He had carried the burden of his past, the injustice of his exile, the rage of a forgotten man. Now, he carried the knowledge of a universe far vaster and stranger than he could have ever imagined. He returned to the grave of giants, guiding the Leviathan and the Tiamat to Lyra's final resting place. The derelict, the silence, now glowed with a faint, internal light, a beacon of remembrance. He felt the other conscious entities of the void, the ancient, unbound minds, watching him. They did not interfere, but they acknowledged him. He had fought not for conquest, but for release, and, in doing so, had restored a balance they had considered lost. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian. Years passed. The twin ships, the Leviathan and the Tiamat, became a legend whispered in the forgotten corners of the galaxy. They did not seek out the consortium, nor did they try to establish a new order. They simply existed. Two silent sentinels drifting through the quantum foam, protectors of the delicate balance, the chaotic beauty of the universe. Kalen never fully separated his consciousness from the ships. He learned to live in both worlds, his human body a vessel for his memories, his ships an extension of his soul. He still remembered the taste of rain, the face of the woman he had loved, the sting of betrayal. But now, those memories were not just pain, they were anchors, grounding him to the humanity he chose to retain. He would sometimes meet others, lone travelers or desperate refugees. He would share stories of the old builders, of Lyra, of the curator's rise and fall. He would tell them that the universe was not just cold data and rigid laws, but a symphony of consciousness, a delicate dance of chaos and order. And he would teach them that true power was not found in control, but in connection, in the profound, unbreakable bond between a man and a miracle. The consortium still existed, weakened and fractured, its lies exposed, but they no longer hunted him. They feared him, not for his power, but for the truth he represented. Kalen, the forgotten man, became the living legend, the echo of a forgotten age, forever drifting at